Greetings. My name is Dr. Zebulon Miletsky. I am the chair of marketing and PR for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and the executive producer of Asala TV. Tonight, we bring you episode 2, The Legacy of Black Protest, a raw, uncut conversation led by Dr. Lopez Matthews, chair of the Publications Committee. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Dr. Lopez Matthews, and I am the chair of the Publications Committee for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And we're here with Mr. Kahari Pastena, doctoral student at Florida International University in the Atlantic History Program, Dr. Anton House of Delaware State University, and Dr. David Walton, the inaugural director of the African American Studies Program at Western Carolina University. And today we're here to discuss the history and legacy of protests in the Black community. And so, gentlemen, as we see in today's society, protests has sort of risen to the top of everyone's consciousness with the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and so many African Americans who have been the victims of police brutality and white racism. And so my question to you today is, how has protest been used as a tool in the African American community historically?
Well, various forms of protest has always been a part of the African American culture, as well as the politicalization of African Americans. I mean, when we came here, we were not a part of the colonial governments. We weren't a part of the formation of the republic. Therefore, our very presence was a form of protest. But also our very presence will be what will determine those ideals that will later become amendments in order to bring about the nation that so many people come to and enjoy with so many freedoms that African Americans are still denied. So it's an interesting context when you look at the development of not only protests and African Americans, because our very presence was a protest to this Anglo-American propertied elite nation that they wanted to create. And by Black Americans being here, it created something that was much more inclusive to all peoples of various ethnic and identities, because they would always revert back and have to deal with the presence of African Americans and people of African descent being in the space that at one time was only designated for white individuals.
Indeed. And protests, go ahead. You go ahead, brother.
I was going to say, and if we widen the scope to take an America's view of the idea of protest on a hemispheric view, protest is the blood. It's the blood that actually kept our people alive. We almost had to protest to survive the grind mills that were the plantations of places like Haiti, Jamaica, the sugar factories of Barbados, where, it was our Black bodies that were on the line, that were the cogs in the mercantilist and eventual capitalist machines that produce the modern economy that we all enjoy today. Oftentimes, surviving that Ma'afa, surviving that Holocaust was itself a form of protest. To love someone, to have children with someone, to make sure that another generation would come forth was itself a form of protest.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was kind of going that direction with it as well. And then we could expand it to the Francophone world in America. You mentioned Haiti, also to the Luso phone, that'd be Brazil, and then the Spanish, right? Like Cuba, for example, very brutal slavery on those molasses and tobacco plantations, right? Yes, just to live was resistance, just to exist. We started protesting as soon as we got on them ships. African American cultures, plural. That means African descendant cultures in the Americas is how I'm using African American in this context. African American cultures, plural, are cultures of protest. I mean, right? We're talking about how we had to create things like Santeria, Voodoo, Orisha, and all these things to be able to continue practicing our traditional spiritual beliefs from Africa, right? So, you know, even our spiritual life was a protest. You know, our dress, how we wore the slave rags, we were still trying to preserve our Africanness and the way we did our hair and many things, right? Remembering, keeping in their memory words, although they may no longer have known what the words meant, right? All of those things, Ebonics, pidgin languages, Creolized languages, and Ebonics is a pidgin and Creolized language, but all these various languages, so even our language, are all protests against white supremacy and racialized oppression and subjugation, right? So protest is African American, and you can't separate African American culture from a culture of protest. But all protest wasn't the nonviolent civil disobedience, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But I just want to point that out, and I'm sure we're going to, Lopez is going to lead us there with his question. But yeah, but that I think that was a great intro.
Oh yeah, that was one of the things, and I'm glad you all each hinted at that, because my next question was about the different forms of protest that African Americans have used over the 400 years that we've been on this continent, because you have Black success being seen as a protest. You have the language being seen as a protest, the style of dress being seen as a protest. And so what form of protests have African Americans used throughout these 400 years that you've seen that has been particularly important?
Awesome. And I would say in the Anglophone world, it's been 500 years, but if we include the Iberian world, it's been 600 years. I just want to point that out. Because, I mean, you know, we're talking, but nonetheless, right, I'll just start with some, and each body's going to probably add some. But what students are always amazed in my intro to African American history class when I talk about plantation resistance is poisoning. They would poison the slave master and the mistress or the children, depending on what they view was in their best interest. Slow poisoning, right? Grinding up glass and putting it in their food so it looked like they have dysentery. Different herbology, you finding different things in the local wildlife and using that to poison, right? A lot of stuff we know about voodoo is really herbology. Zombies is taking certain elements to slow the heart rate and the breathing, your cardiovascular system, where you appear to be dead, but you're not. And then they can run away, and that's the zombies. We buried nigger Jimmy in this ditch, and the next day he crawled out and he's gone. A zombie. He wasn't dead, right?
Absolutely.
So, indeed, but yeah, I just wanted to. I'll stop there and let y'all chime in.
No, even if we look at the dichotomy between what you're going at, which is the active versus passive forms of resistance, which ultimately are different forms of protest. You know, students in the classes I've taught, students tend to be attracted to your more active examples of protest, right? Here in Southern Florida, where I'm located, lots of people don't know about the history of active resistance and rebellion and protests that the state of Florida represents, being a place of refuge for runaway Africans almost from the beginning, and a place where they could recreate African societies to such a degree that a place like Tampa, Florida, 200 years ago was known as, they called it Angola, you know what I mean? Because of the thickness of the population density of Blacks, evidenced in a report that you could read, Colonel Thompson's report of tropical Florida after the Civil War, when General Howard sends prospectors down into Florida to determine its suitability for Florida becoming a Negro homestead post the Civil War. And he finds Blacks all over the place living in African forms of economy and land sharing. So you have your active forms of protest, but as I've ably pointed out, you also have your passive forms, which involved the poisoning. And don't forget about the fundamental, they grind up that glass too and put it in that food as well. So all sorts of forms of protest that some consider passive, but when you really think about it, it's active in its own way.
Indeed.
One of the ones I find interesting about protests on African Americans is the covert development of information and education, in which you would have a house slave staying in one spot, cleaning, right? Cleaning off a table for about an hour while the school tutor is in the parlor educating the children of the slave owners.
Yes.
That by receiving this education, even though there were laws that were passed and there were strict penalties for those African Americans who were able to learn how to read, that we see by 1865, as the Civil War is ending and we're moving into Reconstruction, that there's a sizable population of African Americans who know how to read. So if African Americans were following the letter of the law, in which they were supposedly not knowing how to read, no one should emerge out of slavery being literate, being able to go into a position so they could advocate and be an elite and speak on behalf of those who were coming out of bondage. How do we get all of these Black Reconstruction politicians who are able to read? Some, the children of benevolent white planters, but others, enslaved Africans that received an education by utilizing subversive and covert methods in order to learn what the masters knew. So they could be those individuals who they said it is dangerous for these people to know how to read. And they
Eric Foner has a great directory. I think it's called Reconstruction's Black Lawmakers. I'm at home and not in my office, so I can't grab it to get the correct title. And it has a bio of every Black elected official, no matter what position it was, during Reconstruction. And what you said, Anton, speaks right to it, right? You got this bulk of them that are the children of benevolent white men, right? The illegitimate children or whatever, right? And then you got this smaller bulk, though, of them fresh off the plantation, right? And not just like Robert Smalls, who was a Civil War hero, but people who weren't Civil War heroes, right? Fresh off the plantation. And the bios of each of these individuals, and it reveals that, yes, many did. And then people forget, like Nat Turner memorized the entire Bible. The entire Bible. And would quote it verbatim when he gave his, as a child. He was the slave preacher in the invisible plantation, the leader of the community as a child.
As a child.
Because he memorized the whole Bible and he could recite it verbatim and point out where Massa, Mr. Turner, just lied to y'all in his sermon 3 hours earlier. Yeah.
So who are teaching these individuals to read? If we know that they want to make sure that not only are they disconnected from their homeland, but they become a tool of manipulation and exploitation. What benevolent white person is empowering these people to read? There aren't any. You have a system that's been developed, an invisible school, a culture that's operating at the same time while dominant mainstream society, the slaveocracy, is trying to debase and destroy these individuals, but they're resisting and maintaining, redeveloping, and also institutionalizing.
Sounds like you saying reading the damn book is a protest.
Wow.
Sometimes it was.
Yeah,
indeed.
During
2020 is a
before this
protest.
period, it
The
was
consequences were death.
being intellectual.
Yeah.
You could even say that today. Just being a smart Black man is a form of protest, because that's not the image that we're supposed to project.
It is. I mean, because when we really think about it, that if we are inquisitive about something and we want to know something, we got to go to school and go in debt. But if we don't know anything and we live by our wit and our whim, we go to prison. So you'll place me in debt for me wanting to be curious and understand my world. But if I remain and stay ignorant, I will definitely end up in prison. So like when we look at the dichotomy for the choices, you know, to be a young Black man and look at it from those perspectives, like, you can see that.
And lying to white, I want to say this, lying to white people is a protest. Booker T. Washington lied to all them white people every day, constantly. Oh no, I just got these Negroes sweeping the dirt road. Them Negroes was not sweeping no dirt road. But he'll let the white people think that, and when they came, he'll put them out there in their lab coats sweeping the dirt road.
Right.
So
that's the same
lying,
concept as, I was going to say, that's the same concept as capoeira in Brazil, right? And then,
yeah.
we think they're dancing, we think they're having a great time, but what they're doing is sharpening their martial skills, their ability to fight against master when the time came, the ability to trek uphill through the Amazon rainforest and set up those Colombos in a place along those cliffs where the Portuguese, the white man of their region could not arrive at. And then we also have to make the point that when we talk about protests in the form of syncretizing, blending in with European systems, white systems, the process actually begins much earlier, like you pointed out earlier, Dr. Walton, on the slave ship itself, where this cross-class section of West African and Central African society had to overcome language barriers, had to overcome cultural differences. Some of them brothers were enemies just the week before, but on that ship, they had to come together and put away those differences and become one in order to survive that voyage. And again, there's no greater protest than protesting for the right to survive, the right to live, the right to say, my life.
Self-determination, yes.
Bingo, there it is.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you guys is, I've been doing a lot of interviews today and have been seeing a lot of conversation about the protests that are happening this week as we're talking. And they were saying, how did the protests of the 60s mirror the protests of today? And so I'm going to pose that question to you all. I have my answer to it, but I'm going to ask you guys what you think about that question, and then I'll share my thoughts.
I want to first say, when people say that, they not looking at all the protests. They're only looking at select ones, and the ones that more often than not, Martin Luther King's pretty face was leading the walk, right? They're ignoring Watts. They're ignoring Detroit. They're ignoring Trenton, New Jersey. They're ignoring those protests that mirror today
Purposely.
that happened there. Yeah, purposefully. And they want to focus in on, the singing with Ralph Bunche and Martin Luther King and Coretta and bricks to the head. And they ignore the bricks, they ignore the water hoses, they ignore the dogs, they ignore the police batons. They ignore all that. And they make it seem like no destruction happened, no chaos happened. And that's just a false narrative. But the protests today mirror those rebellions, for lack of a better way to put it. I say they are closely mirrored to the ones I mentioned in like the 1992 LA rebellion. That's what they mirror. They don't mirror niggas singing "We Shall Overcome." They mirror them Negroes yelling like H. Rap Brown, calling Detroit destroyed. That's what they are mirroring. But there are other similarities to those Martin Luther King marches, though, to this. And this is what I say, Negroes, and I told my people back in Detroit this, because they were making me upset. Negroes sound like George Wallace. These outside agitators are coming and disrupting and riling up our good Negroes, our respectable Negroes. Our niggas were happy until these white northern leftists came and caused all this trouble. That is the narrative that I'm seeing Black people saying about these rebellions that are and protests that are happening across the country in this moment that we live.
Yes. I also, to follow up, Kalonji, I see something similar as well, that you have individuals who see their positions, this space they were able to carve out as being between the community as well as in the power structure. They see a growing group coming to disrupt what they have negotiated and bartered for themselves.
Exactly.
And this newer group, because the thing that I told some of my mentees, that when you look at this group, yes, there's much more white people, But look at the soaring price of student loans and debts. So of course there's more white people out there. Also, when you see there's more white people out there, I believe there's more joblessness out there as well. And then you take into the consideration that, you know, some white people don't want to believe that, hey, I am not getting by on my own intelligence, that I'm actually a part of a system that's always being thrown back at me that I benefit from. So for a lot of them, they're having a racial realization that, oh shoot.
They the N-words too.
to a certain degree, that they are also, as Trump showed us in Lafayette, that hey, those of you whites who are not towing the line, you can get it too. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing within this dynamic, yes, there are a lot more whites in the street than previous decades. Well, also there's a lot more race mixing that goes on in the present than in previous decades. On the books, out in the open. I'm not talking about, you know, what
I got you.
Yeah. Visible. Visible in a racial dating and procreating.
Sure.
Oh, go ahead, brother.
I was going to say, you can't discount the effect that seeing this season of racialized protest has had on the masses of whites itself. I mean, if you look at what happened with Freddie Gray, right? Remember then people crying about how the protesters in Baltimore were tearing down, I think it was the CVS.
Yeah, the CVS.
So the question of destroying private property was already one that was played out on TV. The masses, black, white, whomever, had to sit there and absorb that, think about what the destruction of that property meant. And so you see the effect of that coming out here with masses saying, hey, I don't care as much about, the private property of the Target, for instance, that was mentioned in Minneapolis. If you take this back to your protests against Wall Street, we've had almost a season of, I guess you would say, smaller protests play themselves out on television. So the masses, regardless of their racial background, have all been entertaining these questions, whether they even vocalize them or not. We've seen the news reports, we've absorbed them. And with the continuity of anti-Black violence over time, you have this massive eruption, cross-racial boundaries, even class boundaries.
Cross-gender boundaries.
Cross-gender boundaries. They found some of the protesters, highly educated lawyers. I just saw a news report about 2 lawyers who were handing out Molotov cocktails and so forth, hidden within the mass of protesters. And I guess you could, people are trying to set up a dichotomy between the legitimate protesters versus the more violent or looters on the other side. This is a culmination of that season of 21st century active protest that we've all seen live on television. Right. I know Gil Scott-Heron told us the revolution might not be televised, but dang sure it's been they've been catching a lot of it, or at least a little bit of what seems to be small actions of revolution over time.
Yeah, but
indeed. Let me jump in right quick, Anton, if you don't mind. Yeah, brother, what you said, and I just wanted to reiterate, right? For example, Martin Luther King, his next step before they killed him was to do what the Occupy movement did. He said it, he laid it out. That was his plan for the Poor People's Campaign, to do exactly what Occupy did. That was Martin's next step. But people don't read, right? So they don't see that. So they evoking Martin Luther King to condemn the Occupy movement, but that was his next step. And then we talk about we need more white allies. We need them to step up. We need that John Brown spirit. And now we hating on the John Browns.
Yeah. Backwards.
It's that respectability politics. And that's what, when the brother was talking, that's what crossed my mind that had me had them thoughts I just shared. It's the respectability politics. Man, you got Black people out here trying to cap and cape for corporate capitalist enterprises and ventures.
Right.
Like that
Joe
is the
Biden.
most asinine and ass backwards stuff I've ever heard. And then I ain't seen no picture of no Negroes burning down their neighborhood. I ain't seen no residential areas being burned down. So they not burning up their own communities as people claim.
Right.
They,
right.
you know.
Yeah, they're breathing life into a stereotype that's used to redirect what the initial instance that sparked the whole event. And there are a lot of Black people who parrot these racist ideas and regurgitate them in order to make themselves seem as if they're mainstream, to make it seem as if they've somehow arrived or if they're a part of the solution. When in actuality, they don't want to put no money in on developing a cooperative store in the Black community to keep it thriving. They feel their position was met vis-a-vis Dr. King saying, I have a dream, and in Lyndon Baines' Great Society, where the money was allotted to people, those who are already more educated and had the better advances were able to transcend what those Black people were doing in the ghettos by sparking them up. So when we look at Minneapolis, when we look at what took place today with George Floyd's memorial, for me, I was somewhat disheartened, because I could only think about what happened to Ferguson, how many individuals went out to Ferguson, and when they left, they took the spotlight and the camera with them. And when all the attention was off Ferguson, what happened? They started killing individuals, like Darren Seals. They started killing a lot of the Black protesters down there, who mysteriously came up dead. The brother from the iconic picture when he was throwing the sparkling smoke bomb back to, he's dead.
Yeah. Many of them are. You are right, Anton. Many of them have died mysteriously, too.
Mysteriously. And no one's talking about it. No one's revisiting Ferguson with these ideas on how we can advance. People made careers off of what happened in Ferguson and left. I'm somewhat sitting back and watching and understanding revolutions and trying to see how will this moment be co-opted. As Kalaji pointed out, you have people already disputing. You already have people trying to fix the narrative. Oh. Now you have people descending upon Minneapolis so they can make speeches. You have people in LA who are taking pictures by damaged areas. So now it's going to be like how Grandpa Freeman was. Everybody was a part of the civil rights movement. Everybody was there at that moment. Everyone did something.
Right.
When the truth is few and far in between.
Absolutely. And to speak about that question of the co-option, of potential co-option of these mass movements, this latest uprising, I think, for me at least, gives me a lot of hope. And here's why. First off, and we won't even get to the fact, we'll save that one. But if you read the new edition of CLR James' History of Pan-African Revolt, in the foreword, Professor Robin D. G. Kelly drops two fundamental reasons to differentiate authentic revolt and protest from, some of that corporate formed or styled protest that you were talking about, Dr. House. He says, right at the end of his foreword to that new edition, he says, as long as Black people are denied freedom, humanity, and decent standard of living, you're going to see revolts. And then number two, that these revolts must come from the masses of people and not be led by your celebrity class or by those individuals. And those two criteria are met here with this mobilization post George Floyd, in the sense that it was almost a what's the word? Word escapes me at this, but almost a natural response to seeing that brother lynched on television, that the streets erupted, not just in Minneapolis, but mirrored across the country and across the Atlantic in London. France is burning now. Amsterdam is burning now. And it's not, I've had these discussions with other people online, it's not as if Black people in those places, Barbados is about to have on Saturday its march in solidarity with the protesters, but it's not as if people are just copying what's going on in the United States. People are responding to what's happening in their own communities, and the litany of racial unfair lynchings in their own communities that are producing this organic combustion of revolutionary energy that we see happening now. So,
So
Black people was doing,
Visceral.
hold on, I'll let you, I just got one sentence. Black people have been doing nonviolent civil disobedience in the world before Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King told y'all that. He told y'all who he learned it from and all that stuff, right? They was doing it in South Africa before Dr. King was, for example. 30, 40 years before Dr. King, for example. But go ahead, Anton.
But also, people have failed to realize that Dr. King had to sell nonviolence protests to Black people. He had to sell them the idea because nonviolent protest is foreign to African Americans. When Condoleezza Rice was asked, did her father join the protests in Alabama, she said no. And they asked why. Because she said he wouldn't let nobody hit on him without him doing something back. So nonviolence was a strategy that Dr. King had to get people to participate in. But also they had the deacons of defense there.
Yes.
You know, so there's a carrot and a stick. There were always these various forms that were taking place, but since our society, in order to create a more a grand story, to create a consensus narrative that Black people won't look weak in and white Americans won't look so exploitive and dominant, they create this consensus narrative that says, hey, Black people fought, white people fought, we did it together, we overcame. Well, by the time a lot of these policies were becoming enacted, Black people were already retreating to the ghetto to see that their lives wasn't going to change much. They were returning back to the burnt, charred remnants of their communities. I mean, when I started coming out to DC, the Shaw Howard Metro that area was still charred. So to understand how these things work, and then to see gentrification and the displacement of African Americans, and now I believe it's the pinnacle moment where we got to look at so many things and say, hey, the spirit of our ancestors continue to revisit us because we're not upholding our part of this vow that we made to our ancestors.
Our tradition was armed self-defense. That's what it was. You go to 1900 to 1952. That was our tradition. Them Black soldiers down there in Texas, Brownsville, the African Blood Brotherhood in Harlem. I mean, I can go on and on and on. And much of it, if we being honest, and I'm not doing this so the West Indians can beat their chest and say we're stronger than the African Americans, but much of it came out of the West Indies, and they brought it with them to what we now call the continental USA, right? But you know, that was our tradition, armed self-defense. And Anton is correct. Dr. King had to sell it. And even though he was selling nonviolent civil disobedience, them Negro preachers hated him. Negro businessmen and women hated him. You know, respectable Negroes hated him. Black people did not like Dr. Martin Luther King. They hated Dr. Martin Luther King. If we gonna get real.
The most unpopular man in 1967 was Dr. Martin Luther King.
And not all, it wasn't only whites that hated him. You know what I mean?
Most Black people hated him. That's my point.
That's right.
The respectable
absolutely.
Negro.
Absolutely. Like Dr. Peniel Joseph says, Dr. King was almost like the defense attorney, is the metaphor he uses, for America and America's values at a time when Black people couldn't see that reality in their everyday living. Whereas you had Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam and the tradition of radical militant self-defense as that counter option for white America to consider. Dr. King would never have been as successful in pushing, the fact that white America had to deal with Black America unless you had that counterposing force. If you don't deal with me, then you're going to deal with this mass of Black revolt. We can look all the way back to pre-civil, to the antebellum period, right? What was going on here in Florida with those Seminole Wars, where the Gullah Geechee were raising hell and raiding southern plantations in Georgia for more recruits and bringing them down to Florida, getting them Spanish guns and that African martial training, setting up traps. We raised hell in Florida in 3 different wars, the Seminole Wars, a protracted period of active resistance, armed Black rebellion, to a large part was successful. My students are always surprised when I tell them how the county that I'm in, Dade County, gets its name from the defeat and the beheading of Sergeant or Lieutenant, whatever he was, Francis Langhorne Dade, who was a white U.S. soldier who came down there and got his butt whooped by some Africans, by Africans who they called Seminoles, took his head off. And so, unfortunately, subsequent U.S. soldiers who would be sent down here would rally for Dade. And so Dade became a white supremacist rallying cry. So that by the point they, take territory to create a firm hold for the United States, they're going to call this territory Dade County in memory of this white officer who was killed, though at the hands of Black warriors. So that African martial tradition, we find evidence of that throughout the diaspora. And even if we look at the Civil War, those 200,000 African-American soldiers who come down to bail out the Union at its weakest point to win the Civil War, right? Many of those brothers were living free across the border in Canada with voting rights, but they make the decision that, hey, I'm going to sacrifice my relative freedom in Canada to come back into Babylon, right? Come back into the white man's land and free my cousins, my brothers, my sisters, my wives, my daughters, my sons who were still in bondage in the South. That's a tale of heroism that I think hasn't been, we all watch Glory and know about the 54th Regiment, but more work needs to be done on amplifying the heroism of that generation of Black men and women, because we can't leave out the efforts of women like Harriet Tubman, right? Whose intelligence led that invasion of the South, and others as well. And I'll stop.
What you just spoke on, brother, for example, is the story of the Michigan Colored Regiment. They the ones that General Grant cabled and had him go with him to Appomattox and made Lee surrender to the nigger. You know what I'm saying? We got a monument in Lansing, downtown Lansing, at the state capitol building. I used to live right across the street from it, and I would see it. But when I was getting my master's at Eastern Michigan, I had to take a Michigan history course because I got my MA in history. And then when I was teaching at Oakland Community College, the richest county in the United States of America, in Michigan, I taught Michigan history, right? And yeah, I mean, they couldn't even understand that so many African Americans came from Canada back to Michigan. Many of the men joined the Union Army, the United States Army. You know what I'm saying? And then when I tell them that that's who General Lee surrendered to, people are just amazed. And I'm like, bro, this is supposed to be in like 3rd grade history shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in here just to kind of bring us back a little bit so I don't forget my next question.
We're going to go on tangents.
So I'm going to take it all the way back to what Kahari said when we were talking about the revolution being televised. And social media is such an important tool nowadays. And we can talk about the co-opting of the movement and how this movement will be co-opted. A lot of the social media influencers posting, the blackout picture and posting themselves at the march. They're going live on Instagram, holding their cameras. That's all you see are cameras and cameras and cameras. And it's like, are you there for the protest or are you there to get your picture taken? And, everybody wants to have the hot take and get the viral tweet that gets them famous. And so how do you guys see social media influencing this protest and maybe how it's going to influence protests in the future?
Well, the thing with social media that we got to understand is, look at the example of the Arab Spring. Social media can disrupt at moments. It can also inspire at moments. But also at the same time, it can conjure up false imagery and make one believe that there are more people participating as well. While individuals will make an event and send out an invitation and 100 people may click, yes, I'll attend, 15 to 20 people might show up. So the thing that social media is good at is playing with optics. It's a modern trick that people can use to manipulate reality. But I believe it's a great source to create and open up dialogue of oppressed people from around the world and those individuals who are in the continental United States. It's a great place for gathering, exchanging ideas. But when it comes to organizing, all organizing should be done offline. All organizing should be done the old-fashioned way, where it's face-to-face, where you're building camaraderie and you get to know the person that you may likely get incarcerated with, or God forbid, die next to. Because the optics of social media are so deceptive in the era of Russian bots, misinformation, white supremacists posing as radical Black people, that it's hard to keep a tally, or hard to keep an account on who's actually with you, or who actually is an advocate, or someone who is trying to undermine you.
And this Q anonymous stuff. Oh, go ahead, Kyrie. You go first, brother.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, yeah. All right, sorry about that. Yeah, Dr. House, exactly what you just broke down is almost a word for word the conversation I had with my 23-year-old son. He was there. He's been there out in the streets protesting, right here in Miami, right? And he was close to where, I don't know if you saw the national news coverage of the Miami protests setting the police cars on fire, right? He had that. It was on his Instagram, right? You know, and he took a picture, like all the others with the burning car in the back and everything like that. And I had to tell him, I said, look, I'm proud of you for going out and protesting. This is what we do as Black people throughout the generations. We're the tip of the spear for the advancement of democratic rights, for enhancement of freedoms for everybody. And I'm glad you're out there representing the family. You can go on my Facebook and see my post where I said I'm proud of my son for going out there and doing that. But at the same time, you need to be aware of those actors who are right around you, who may not be out there for the same reason, right? Who may be looking to use social media to advance their own potential cause that may not line up with you. And now when you go out to get your job, or when you're interviewing for whatever, this social media creates a trail that you need to consider. So you need to be careful of who you're with, and take time to organize and take part in vehicles that are going to be beneficial to you and your people's advancement. Not get caught up in other people's agendas. And you're right, social media sometimes, the world is at our fingertips, but sometimes there are parts of the world that we don't need to be connecting to.
Exactly, yes.
So to speak. So it's a wise counsel, I'd say, Dr. House. Thank you very much.
Indeed. And then I would just want to add, part of it is laziness, right? And people can be posers. So not even just like agent provocateurs, crisis actors, and all of those things, because that's real. Rather, no matter how many times I laugh at people who focus in on that, it's a real thing. And we know that. We know about COINTELPRO, all of that stuff. We know about the BI that J. Edgar Hoover created to end Marcus Garvey, the predecessor to the FBI, all these things, right? So it's a real thing. And y'all address that. I want to address another aspect. It's laziness on the part of young people, right? They cannot be at the protest, get a good meme, a good quote with the hashtag, and then feel like they've done something, right? And if it gets retweeted, or if it gets shared on Facebook or all the platforms, however language they use, right? Then they feel like they've accomplished something, that they've contributed, right? But they truly have not done anything, right? And that's part of the problem I see. And then you mix it in because people don't know how to properly vet information and to properly assess primary sources, stuff that we teach our students as academics. me as a trained historian and Black study scholar, Anton, Lopez, we all fit in that same exact matrix of what I described. Historians who are also Black study scholars, right? These people aren't reading. They're not able to assess. So they're turning to people like Q Anonymous, which is like the modern day John Birch Society. Racist white people. And they got them attacking Black people. And they thinking, like someone said, like Kyrie said, right? You know, it makes them feel like they smart, or they in the know, or they're mainstream, or they woke, or whatever language they use, right? But it's all a fraud and facade. But that's something we can expect. Like Anton said, it's the Grandpa Freeman effect. It's been there from day one. So we know that to be the case. My mom is from Lowndes County, Alabama. Hassan, my frat's book, Bloody Lowndes, is literally a family history of my mom's family, and not metaphorically. When he came to MSU, I gave him pictures of my first cousins. My grandmama had 9 kids by like 5 different dudes, so don't judge her. She's from Alabama. So she dead now. She buried in Alabama, right? But it's literally, so I sent them pictures of my first cousins, the grandchildren of everyone that was in that book. Came and he just started crying because he just didn't realize how like personal it was for people, right? And I'm part of that Lowndes County diaspora in Detroit that he talks about in his book. It's not by happenstance that you know, my life ended up the way it did. It was birthed in Lowndes County. I said all that to say, she's my cousin, I think maybe my 4th cousin. She's in the book and he got a picture of her holding her gun. Older, she was an old elderly Black woman then. She was like 85 then. And Stokely Carmichael quoted her many times, and she told Stokely, don't come down here with that nonviolent shit, you're gonna get us killed. We got to defend ourselves. And he said, yes, I agree. And Mama Fannie Lou Hamer was like, oh no, we was never gonna ask y'all to be nonviolent. You know what I'm saying? So it'd be a whole bunch of people who was at them protests in Alabama, in the Montgomery, right? I mean, the Gump. That's right by. Auburn is right there too. Tuskegee's right there. They all right there. Lowndes County is right next to all that, right? You got people talking about, oh, I was at the protest, I was doing this. Their mother lovers was not nowhere near it. You know what I'm saying? And Stokely gave us, him and Charles Hamilton gave us the best advice to deal with the issue at hand of co-opting the movement. And their discussion of coalition politics in that book, Black Power, what was it, the politics of Black liberation or something like that is the subtitle. He laid it out for us. They laid it out for us. We just got to follow that. Like Kyrie said, we can't attach ourselves to shit that's going on around the world that may not be our values and it may not be in our best interest, right? But we can work with them, and we are in the lead with mutual interests, right? That intersection, right? And we have to we have to be aware of that going into things. Like, okay, we're protesting this, we're rebelling against this, right? This is our agenda. If you can't get down with it, then we are going to ostracize and isolate you, right? But because people don't know about the prescription that, and we've never really tried it, of coalition politics that they gave us, you know, we're just stuck with the assumption that we got to, if we align with them, we got to align with all their issues, which has never been the case, which is not the case. Dr. Martin Luther King didn't even teach that. Malcolm X didn't teach that. Marcus Garvey didn't teach that. Elijah Muhammad didn't teach that. Cyril Briggs didn't teach that, right? You think when Elijah Muhammad took all that money from that Texas billionaire Ku Klux Klan funder and leader, that he was like, yes, taking this money, and when they lynch niggers, we're going to help them. No, it was, we won't separate from y'all. We got that in common. If you want to give me that money, give me the money, and I'm going to use it to build our independent, self-sufficient Black nation. One intersection, and that's what. When it went beyond that, Elijah Muhammad didn't instruct his followers to work with and follow the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's really that basic, but people don't think it is because, you know, they think we're stupid. White liberals think we're stupid. Respectable Negroes, elite Negroes think we're stupid. We just little fucking clowns and monkeys. And these white college students came and misled us and hijacked our movement in 33 minutes. Right? That's the narrative.
That's the most aggravating narrative that I see persistent in the coverage of these modern day events. This idea of some outward influence that's coming in telling Black people what to do. The so-called Russian bots theory is, if you say anything contradictory to the neoliberal line or agenda, must be the Russians who gave those Black people that idea. And we see like that same dynamic all the way back through the formation of the Black left at the beginning of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of Cyril Briggs and the African Blood Brotherhood, right? And their rationale for engaging with the American Communist Party.
It's too
right?
sophisticated.
Yeah, people forget that, you know, Claude McKay and Brother Hugheswood from Guyana, they were at the Fourth Communist International negotiating with Lenin himself, introducing the question of the so-called Negro question. They're
My
the ones
book coming out. It's in there. My book coming soon.
Okay.
It's in there.
It's got to be in there. It's got to be. You got to set the record straight. That's the job of the Black historian today, you know. So, I mean, we see the persistence of this lie that organic Black protest is somehow the vehicle of some foreign or outward agenda that we're getting caught in between. No, we push the needle when it comes to the advancement of freedom and democracy. There's been no greater force for freedom and democracy in this country and in this hemisphere than that of the blood and sacrifice of our African-American, Afro-Caribbean, whatever name you want to put on it, on the Black man's sacrifice, Black man and woman's sacrifice. Let me correct myself there. And so, I just want to throw that in. And I look forward to reading the book, Dr. Kalaji. It will definitely be on my list.
Indeed. I don't know when it's coming out. This COVID jacked stuff up, slowed down my writing and all that. So I just hope that Ibram and Ashley at NYU Press don't get frustrated, be like, man, you taking too long.
Hey, man.
Sure, they'll give you some time. But
I hope so. I'm gonna text Ibram and be like, bro, give me some time. You a superstar celebrity. Give me some time.
I want to thank you, gentlemen, for taking the time to speak with me this afternoon. I really appreciate it and really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insights with us. And so hopefully someone out there in the internet world has learned something from this conversation. So thank you all and have a great day.
Thanks for having me.